There is a part of you that you've been running from your entire life. A darkness, not evil, but denied. The anger you've learned to swallow. The ambition you've been taught to hide. The selfishness you've rebranded as consideration. The rage that sits beneath your smile. You've spent years, maybe decades, building walls around these parts of yourself, convinced that if you acknowledge them, if you let them breathe, you'll become something monstrous. But Carl Jung discovered something that changes everything. The darkness you refuse to face doesn't disappear. It doesn't dissolve because you ignore it. It controls you, from the shadows, from the basement of your psyche. And the secret to real power, to authentic presence, to becoming whole, isn't in destroying that darkness. It's in integrating it. We live in a world obsessed with light, with positivity, with being good, kind, agreeable, palatable. We're told to think positive, to let go of negativity, to rise above our darker impulses. And on the surface, this sounds beautiful, enlightened, but underneath, it's creating an epidemic of fragmented people. People who smile while they're dying inside. People who say they're fine when they're falling apart. People who've amputated entire dimensions of their humanity because those dimensions don't fit the acceptable narrative. We've become experts at projection, at seeing our own denied darkness in others and attacking it there, at being triggered by traits we refuse to see in ourselves. And in this constant performance of light, we've lost something essential. We've lost our wholeness, our depth, our power. That's where this exploration begins. In the gap between who you pretend to be and who you actually are. Between the persona you've constructed for social survival and the shadow you've buried for the same reason. Jung spent his life studying this phenomenon. He called it the shadow. Not because it's evil, but because it's hidden. It's everything you've decided isn't acceptable about yourself. Everything you've repressed, denied, disowned. And here's the paradox that most people never understand. The more you push your shadow away, the more it runs your life. The more you try to be only light, the more your darkness leaks out in ways you can't control. In passive aggression, in sudden outbursts, in self-sabotage, in attraction to people who embody what you deny. Jung's secret wasn't just psychological theory. It was practical alchemy. He discovered that the path to real power, to genuine transformation, doesn't run away from darkness. It runs straight through it, not by becoming your darkness, but by integrating it, by acknowledging it, understanding it, and reclaiming the energy you've been using to suppress it. Because suppression takes enormous energy. It's exhausting to maintain a version of yourself that's only half real. And that exhaustion, that constant vigilance against your own nature, is what keeps most people stuck. Powerless, fragmented, living at half capacity because half of who they are is locked in the basement. Let's go deeper into what this actually means. Your shadow isn't some abstract concept. It's specific, personal. It's formed in childhood, when you learned what was acceptable and what wasn't. When you discovered that certain parts of you received love and other parts received rejection. Maybe you learned that anger wasn't allowed, so you buried it and became the peacekeeper. Maybe you learned that vulnerability was weakness, so you buried it and became the stoic. Maybe you learned that your needs didn't matter, so you buried them and became the caretaker. Whatever the pattern, the mechanism is the same. You split yourself. You kept the parts that were rewarded and buried the parts that were punished. And you've been living as that split person ever since. The problem is that those buried parts don't die. They don't go away. They become autonomous. They operate from the unconscious, influencing your choices, your reactions, your relationships. Have you ever noticed how you sometimes do things that surprise you? How you snap at someone for no reason, or make a decision that contradicts everything you claim to value, or feel an inexplicable attraction to someone who's completely wrong for you. That's not randomness. That's your shadow speaking. That's the disowned part of you trying to get your attention the only way it knows how. Through disruption. Jung called this projection. When you refuse to acknowledge a trait in yourself, you start seeing it everywhere in others. The person who's always complaining about others being selfish, they're terrified of their own selfishness. The person who's constantly calling out manipulation, they're denying their own manipulative tendencies. The person who judges others for being weak, they're running from their own vulnerability. This isn't conscious. You genuinely believe you're seeing something in the other person. But what you're actually seeing is your own reflection. Your own disowned shadow projected onto someone else's screen. And you attack it there because you can't face it in yourself. I watched this play out with someone close to me. They prided themselves on being rational, logical, completely in control of their emotions. They looked down on people who were emotional, who cried, who let feelings guide their decisions. And then one day, after years of this performance, they had a breakdown. Everything they'd been suppressing came flooding out. Not because they were weak, but because suppression has a limit. Because you can only hold back a dam for so long before it breaks. And when it broke, they weren't prepared. They didn't have the tools to navigate their own emotions because they'd spent decades pretending those emotions didn't exist. That's the cost of shadow denial. Not just exhaustion, but eventual collapse. Not just disconnection from yourself, but disconnection from everyone around you. Because you can't have real intimacy when you're only showing half of who you are. You can't have real relationships when you're in constant performance mode. People sense it. They might not be able to articulate it, but they feel the inauthenticity. They feel the distance, and they respond to the version of you that you're presenting, which means they never actually know you. They know your persona, your mask, your carefully curated acceptable self. But you, the real you, that person stays hidden, lonely, unseen. The hidden mechanism here is simple but profound. What you resist persists. What you deny in yourself, you empower. Jung understood this completely. He saw that the goal of human development isn't to become perfect. It's to become whole, and wholeness includes darkness. It includes the parts you'd rather not acknowledge. The selfishness, the cruelty, the pettiness, the rage, the desire for revenge, the envy, the pride, all of it. Not to act on these things unconsciously, but to see them consciously. To own them, to integrate them. Because when you integrate your shadow, something remarkable happens. You stop projecting. You stop being triggered by others. You stop living in reaction. And you reclaim an enormous amount of energy that was being used to maintain the illusion of being only light. Power begins when you stop running from your own darkness. When you turn around and face it. When you ask it what it wants. When you listen to what it has to teach you. Because your shadow isn't your enemy. It's your teacher. It's the part of you that holds everything you need to become whole. Jung's law of integration is straightforward but challenging. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Read that again. You don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, by pretending you're only good, by performing spirituality or positivity. You become enlightened by making the darkness conscious, by bringing what's hidden into the light of awareness, by acknowledging what you've been denying. This is the path, not around the darkness, through it. In Jung's framework, the shadow contains not just negative traits, but also positive ones you've disowned. Maybe you've buried your ambition because you learned that wanting things was greedy. Maybe you've suppressed your creativity because you learned that being different was dangerous. Maybe you've denied your power because you learned that being strong threatened others. The shadow holds everything you've decided isn't acceptable. And that includes gifts, talents, strengths you're afraid to own because owning them would change how people see you. Think about the people you admire most. The ones with real presence, real depth, real power. They're not one-dimensional. They're not performing constant positivity. There's something complex about them. Something that suggests they've seen their own darkness and made peace with it. They can be kind without being weak, strong without being cruel, ambitious without being ruthless. How? Because they've integrated. They've stopped pretending they're only one thing. They've acknowledged the full spectrum of their humanity, and in that acknowledgement, they've found freedom. Freedom from performance, freedom from pretense, freedom from the exhausting work of maintaining an impossible image. Jung worked with patients for decades, and one pattern emerged consistently. The people suffering the most weren't the ones who had done terrible things. They were the ones who refused to acknowledge the capacity for terrible things. They were the ones who had built their identity on being good, and that identity was suffocating them. Because when you base your sense of self on being only light, any appearance of darkness becomes an existential threat. You can't be human. You can't be messy. You can't be angry or selfish or petty or any of the 1,000 small ways that humans actually are. And that rigidity, that inability to accept your own complexity, creates enormous psychological suffering. The application in power is direct. Integrated people are harder to manipulate. They're harder to control. Because the primary way people are controlled is through shame, through threats to their identity. If you do that, people will think you're selfish. If you say that, people will think you're cruel. But if you've already acknowledged your selfishness, if you've already seen your capacity for cruelty, those threats lose their power. You're not performing goodness anymore. You're just being human. And humans are complex, contradictory, capable of both extraordinary kindness and casual cruelty. When you own that, when you stop pretending otherwise, you become immune to the manipulation that works on everyone else. Think about leaders throughout history who integrated their shadow. Churchill, deeply flawed, acknowledged his black dog depression, acknowledged his ruthlessness, and because he owned these things, because he didn't pretend to be a saint, he had the flexibility to make impossible decisions. To be brutal when brutality was necessary and compassionate when compassion was strategic. He wasn't paralyzed by his own self-image. He wasn't performing for approval. He was integrated enough to contain contradiction, to be multiple things at once without fragmenting. Or consider Johnny Cash, the man in black. He didn't hide his darkness. He sang about it. He owned his addiction, his failures, his cruelty, his mistakes. And in that radical honesty, he became more than a performer. He became a voice for everyone who'd ever struggled with their own shadow. His power didn't come from pretending to be good. It came from being honest about being human. And people responded to that honesty with loyalty that transcended music. Because they saw themselves in him. Not in his perfection, but in his integration. But here's the ethical tension. Does integrating your shadow mean acting on every dark impulse? Absolutely not. This is where most people misunderstand Jung's work. Integration isn't about becoming your shadow. It's about acknowledging it, understanding it, and choosing consciously how to work with it. When you deny anger, it leaks out in passive aggression. But when you acknowledge anger, when you see it and understand where it comes from, you can channel it into boundary setting, into fuel for change, into clarity about what you will and won't accept. The anger doesn't go away, but it stops controlling you unconsciously and starts serving you consciously. The moral reversal Jung offers is this. The people who do the most harm are often the ones who believe they're incapable of harm. the ones who've so thoroughly denied their shadow that they can't see it operating. They justify cruelty as kindness. They call control love. They reframe destruction as help. Because they can't acknowledge their darker motives even to themselves. But the person who's integrated their shadow, they know what they're capable of. And that knowledge creates responsibility, creates choice, creates the ability to catch yourself before your shadow acts unconsciously. This is the law. The darkness you integrate becomes power. The darkness you deny becomes poison. One serves you, the other sabotages you, and the difference is consciousness, awareness, the willingness to look at the parts of yourself you'd rather not see. So where are you in this process? Right now, in your actual life. What parts of yourself have you been denying? What traits do you see in others that trigger you disproportionately? What aspects of your personality have you learned to suppress because they weren't acceptable? The answers to these questions are your roadmap. Because whatever you're denying is exactly what you need to integrate. Whatever you're running from is exactly what's running you. Let's do some honest shadow work right here. Think about the last time you were deeply triggered by someone. Not just annoyed, but triggered. Disproportionately angry or disgusted or threatened. Now ask yourself this uncomfortable question. What did they embody that you've denied in yourself? Maybe they were selfish in a way you've never allowed yourself to be. Maybe they were vulnerable in a way you've learned to hide. Maybe they were powerful in a way you've been taught to diminish. Whatever it wasn't really about them. It was a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They just reflect what you're not ready to see. Nietzsche understood this from a different angle. He talked about the will to power. Not power over others, but power to become yourself fully. To actualize everything you're capable of. And he recognized that most people never do this because they're too busy performing morality. Playing the role of the good person instead of becoming the whole person. He wrote, "Beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster." But then he added something crucial. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. This isn't a warning, it's an invitation. To look into your own abyss. To face your own monsters. Not to become them, but to understand them. To integrate them. To reclaim the energy you've been using to fight yourself. The descent into your shadow feels dangerous at first. Like opening a door you've kept locked because you're afraid of what's behind it. But here's what Jung discovered through decades of work. The shadow is only dangerous when it's unconscious. When it's acknowledged, when it's brought into awareness, it loses its autonomous power. It stops hijacking you. It stops leaking out in ways you can't control. And the energy you were using to suppress it becomes available for something else. For creativity, for presence, for actual power instead of performed strength. Every time you deny a part of yourself, you fragment. You split into the acceptable version and the hidden version. And living as a split person is exhausting. You have to monitor yourself constantly. Watch your words. Control your reactions. Make sure nothing slips through. It's like maintaining two separate identities. The public one and the private one. And the gap between them creates anxiety. Creates shame. Creates the constant fear of being found out. Of someone seeing through your performance and discovering that you're not who you pretend to be. But when you integrate, when you acknowledge the full spectrum of who you are, that gap closes. There's no performance because there's nothing to perform. There's no fear of being found out because you're not hiding anything. You're not claiming to be perfect. You're just claiming to be human. Complex, contradictory, capable of both light and darkness. And in that claim, in that radical self-honesty, you find something most people never find. You find peace. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of not being at war with yourself. The transformation isn't about becoming darker. It's about becoming whole, about reclaiming the parts of yourself you've exiled, about understanding that your anger might be righteous, your selfishness might be healthy boundaries, your pride might be deserved self-respect. The shadow isn't just negative. It's often positive traits you've learned to suppress. And when you bring them back, when you integrate them consciously, you become more than you were. Not by adding something new, but by reclaiming something that was always yours. Jung worked with a concept called the golden shadow. These are positive traits you've disowned. Maybe you're actually brilliant, but you've learned to hide it so you don't threaten others. Maybe you're naturally charismatic, but you've dimmed yourself so you don't take up too much space. Maybe you're powerful, but you've learned that power isn't feminine or isn't humble or isn't spiritual, so you've suppressed it. These gifts, these strengths, they're in your shadow too. And reclaiming them is just as important as acknowledging the darker aspects. I knew someone who spent years playing small. They were incredibly talented, but every time they were praised, they deflected. They minimized their achievements. They credited others. And they thought this was humility. But it wasn't humility. It was fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of standing out. Fear of what it would mean to own their power fully. And that fear kept them stuck for years. Not because they lacked ability, but because they'd learned that having ability and showing it made other people uncomfortable. So they kept their gifts in the shadow. They performed mediocrity to maintain belonging. And it was killing them slowly. The turning point came when they realized something crucial. Hiding their gifts wasn't protecting anyone. It was just ensuring that those gifts would never be used. That the world would never benefit from them. That they would reach the end of their life having hidden the very thing they came here to share. And for what? So other people wouldn't feel uncomfortable? So they wouldn't be accused of arrogance? So they could maintain the illusion of being humble while actually being terrified? Once they saw this clearly, everything changed. They started owning their talents, speaking up, taking space. And yes, some people were uncomfortable. Some people accused them of changing, of becoming arrogant, of thinking they were better than everyone else. But they weren't better. They were just no longer hiding. And the people who truly loved them, they celebrated the emergence, because they'd been watching someone slowly suffocate and now that person could finally breathe. This is shadow integration in action. Not becoming something you're not. Becoming something you've always been but were too afraid to acknowledge. And when you do this, when you reclaim both the dark and the golden shadow, you become integrated. Whole. And wholeness is magnetic. People sense it. They might not understand it, but they feel it. The person who's no longer performing. The person who's comfortable with their own complexity. The person who can be strong and vulnerable, ambitious and compassionate, selfish and generous, all without contradiction. Because they've stopped pretending they're one-dimensional. Nietzsche called this the Übermensch. Not a superhuman, but a whole human. Someone who's overcome the herd mentality of performing acceptable traits and denying unacceptable ones. Someone who's integrated enough to contain contradiction, to be multiple things at once, to move fluidly between different aspects of themselves depending on what the situation requires. Not because they're manipulative, but because they're complete. They have access to their full range, their anger and their compassion, their selfishness and their generosity, their cruelty and their kindness. And they choose consciously which to express, rather than being controlled by whichever aspect they haven't acknowledged. This is the rebirth, the moment when you stop living as a fragment and start living as a whole. When you stop performing acceptability and start embodying authenticity. When you realize that your power doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being integrated, from knowing yourself completely, including the parts you'd rather not see. From accepting that you're capable of both creation and destruction, both love and hatred, both nobility and pettiness. And from that acceptance, from that radical honesty with yourself, you build something unshakable. Not an image, not a persona, but a self, a whole, integrated self that doesn't need to perform because it's not ashamed of what it actually is. You stop explaining yourself because you're no longer defending against your own shadow. You stop seeking approval because you've approved of yourself, darkness and all. You stop being triggered by others because you've seen those same traits in yourself and made peace with them. You stop living in reaction because you've integrated enough to respond from wholeness rather than woundedness. This is the promise of shadow work, not perfection, wholeness, and wholeness is worth more than all the performed perfection in the world. Let's make this practical. Let's bring Jung's theory into your daily life. Here's where shadow work actually begins. Start noticing your triggers, not just feeling them, but studying them. The next time someone does something that makes you irrationally angry or disgusted or threatened, pause. Don't act, don't justify, just notice, and then ask yourself, what is this person showing me about myself that I don't want to see? The answer is always there if you're willing to look honestly. Second practice. Journal about the traits you judge most harshly in others. Make a list. Selfishness, manipulation, weakness, arrogance, whatever comes up. And then, and this is the hard part, write about times when you've embodied those same traits. Times when you were selfish, when you manipulated, when you were weak, when you were arrogant, not to shame yourself, but to see clearly, to acknowledge that you're capable of everything you judge, that you're human, that you contain multitudes. And those multitudes include darkness. Third practice. Find the golden shadow. What positive traits do you suppress? What gifts do you hide? What parts of yourself do you dim so others feel comfortable? Write them down, and then ask yourself what it would mean to stop hiding. What would it cost? What would it give you? Who would you threaten? Who would you inspire? And then, slowly, start testing it. Start taking up a little more space. Start owning your gifts a little more openly. Start letting yourself be seen for who you actually are, not who you've performed to be safe. Here's the core law of shadow integration. What you refuse to see in yourself controls you. What you acknowledge loses its autonomous power. Consciousness is the key, not action on every dark impulse, but awareness of every dark impulse. The anger doesn't need to be expressed as rage, but it needs to be seen, acknowledged, understood, and then it can be channeled into boundaries, into clarity, into fuel for transformation, but only if you see it first. Jung's wisdom wasn't academic, it was practical. He saw patients destroy their lives because they couldn't acknowledge their shadows. He saw marriages end because neither person could see their own contribution to the problems. He saw careers sabotaged because people acted out their unacknowledged darkness in unconscious ways. And he saw that the solution wasn't to become perfect. It was to become conscious, to see clearly, to own completely, to integrate fully. Think about your life right now. The patterns that keep repeating. The same conflicts in different relationships. The same self-sabotage in different forms. The same triggers with different people. These aren't accidents. These are your shadow speaking. These are the parts of yourself you haven't integrated trying to get your attention the only way they know how. Through disruption, through pain, through forcing you to finally look at what you've been avoiding. The work isn't easy. Shadow integration never is, because it requires you to see things about yourself you'd rather not see. To acknowledge traits you've spent your life denying. To own parts of yourself you've been taught are unacceptable. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is living as a fragment, performing an acceptable version of yourself while your real self suffocates in the basement. leaking shadow in unconscious ways, being triggered constantly, living in reaction, exhausting yourself with the maintenance of an impossible image. When you integrate your shadow, several things happen. First, you stop projecting. You stop seeing your own denied traits in others and attacking them there. You see clearly that what bothered you about them was never really about them. Second, you reclaim energy. Enormous amounts of energy. Because suppression is exhausting, and you're no longer suppressing. Third, you become more resilient. Because you've seen your own darkness and survived. You know what you're capable of, and that knowledge creates strength. Not the brittle strength of denial, but the flexible strength of integration. Fourth, you become more compassionate. Not the performative compassion of people who've never acknowledged their own darkness, but real compassion. The kind that comes from recognizing that everyone is fighting shadows. That everyone contains darkness. That nobody is one-dimensional. And that judgment of others is usually just projected judgment of yourself. When you've integrated your own shadow, you naturally extend more grace to others. Because you've seen how hard the work is, how uncomfortable it is to face what you've been denying, how much courage it takes to be honest with yourself. And fifth, you become powerful. Not power over others, but power within yourself. The power of wholeness, the power of authenticity, the power of someone who's not afraid of their own complexity, who can navigate their full range, who can be both light and dark, both strong and vulnerable, both ambitious and content, who's integrated enough to be fluid, to respond to situations from wholeness rather than from whatever fragment they're currently identifying with. Jung spent his life teaching this. Not through abstract theory, but through practical work. Through helping people face their shadows. Through showing them that the darkness they feared wasn't their enemy but their teacher. Through demonstrating that integration, not perfection, is the goal. And through living it himself. He had his own breakdowns. His own descent. His own shadow work. And he emerged from it whole. Not perfect. Whole. And that wholeness gave him clarity that transformed psychology. If this resonates with you, if you feel that pull toward wholeness over performance, toward integration over denial, then stay with this work. Subscribe, because we're going deeper. We're exploring more of Jung's insights, more of Nietzsche's challenges, more of the timeless wisdom that points toward the same truth. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be whole. You don't need to be only light. You need to integrate your darkness. You don't need to perform goodness. You need to embody humanity in all its complexity. The darkness you fear holds the power you need. Not to become dark, but to become whole. Not to act out your shadow unconsciously, but to integrate it consciously. Not to let it run you, but to reclaim it, understand it, and transform it from enemy to ally. This is Jung's secret. This is the path, not around the shadow, but through it. Not away from darkness, but into integration. Not toward perfection, but toward wholeness. And wholeness, despite everything you've been taught, is where real power lives. In the person who's seen their own darkness and made peace with it. In the person who's stopped performing and started being. In the person who's integrated enough to contain contradiction without fragmenting. That person is unshakable, not because they're perfect, but because they're whole. And wholeness cannot be broken by judgment or shame or fear. Because it's already seen everything. Already acknowledged everything. Already integrated everything. Integrate the darkness you fear. Not because it makes you dark, but because it makes you whole. And whole people change the world in ways fragments never can.